The spotlight hums softly above an empty stage. Somewhere in that quiet space, a voice once soared, powerful, elegant, and unlike any other. She carried two worlds in her soul, the rhythm of Cuba and the tenderness of Puerto Rico, blending them into a sound that could only belong to her. That woman was Angela Bofill. Before fame, before heartbreak, before the silence, she was a dreamer who dared to stand where few Latin women had stood before in the heart of American R&B. But what happens when the gift that defines your life suddenly disappears? This isn't just a story about music. It's about courage, loss, and the echo of a voice that refused to fade. Let's get into her story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea, sit back, and let's start this journey together. Before the fame, before the applause, there was a little girl in the Bronx who sang to the rhythm of her neighborhood. The world around her was alive with music, the pulse of congas drifting from open windows, the laughter of children echoing through narrow streets, the hum of a city that never slept. That was where Angela Bofill first found her voice. She was born on the 2nd of May, 1954, in Brooklyn, New York, to a Cuban father and a Puerto Rican mother. Her father worked the docks as a longshoreman, and when he wasn't hauling cargo, he played the conga drums at family gatherings. Her mother filled the house with boleros and old records from San Juan, while Angela soaked in every note like sunlight through a window. Their modest apartment became her first stage, a place where dreams were louder than the city outside. Growing up in the Bronx meant learning rhythm from the streets. Angela heard salsa, gospel, jazz, and soul blending together in the soundscape of New York. It was a melting pot of cultures and voices, and she was right in the middle of it. She once said her earliest education didn't come from books, but from listening, to the horns of traffic, the voices in the church choir, the heartbeat of the city itself. Her mother believed that talent without discipline was just noise. If you want to sing, she told her daughter, you must study it. And Angela did. She joined New York's all-city choirs, a prestigious group of students chosen from all 5 boroughs, and learned the beauty of harmony, control, and teamwork. She spent her weekends studying classical technique, reading sheet music, and rehearsing for hours while other kids played outside. It wasn't sacrifice to her. It was purpose. By the time Angela entered Hunter College High School, her gift was undeniable. Her teachers described her as serious, almost old-fashioned in her dedication. She didn't just want to sing, she wanted to understand music. In those years, she discovered opera, jazz, and soul, blending them quietly inside her own voice. In 1972, she graduated and went on to the Manhattan School of Music, one of the most respected conservatories in the country. There, she learned to use her voice not only as melody but as emotion, an instrument with range and truth. She studied vocal performance, theory, and composition, earning her bachelor's degree in 1976. Her professors admired her precision. Her classmates admired her courage. There were few women of color in those halls then, but Angela Bofill stood her ground, always reminding herself that her roots were her power. The 1,970 inches America were changing fast. The civil rights movement had left echoes of both progress and prejudice. In the world of popular music, Black and Latin artists were often boxed into narrow categories. Record labels didn't know what to do with someone like Angela, a singer trained in classical technique who could slip between R&B, jazz, and Latin rhythms with ease. But those boundaries only made her dream louder. Her early performances in small clubs around New York were modest, but they carried something unmistakable: authenticity. When Angela sang, she didn't just perform a song, she lived inside it. Her voice had warmth and ache, the kind that made people stop mid-conversation. She could take a room of strangers and make them feel like family. In those late-night sessions, she began to attract the attention of musicians and producers who recognized something rare. One of them was Dave Valentine, a flutist who became both her mentor and friend. Through him, Angela met producers Dave Grusin and Larry Rosen, who would later help shape her first major step into the industry. But at this stage, she wasn't thinking about fame or record deals. She was chasing something purer, a sense of belonging in music itself. Every song she sang was a way of reaching back to her family's roots, to her father's drumbeat, to the sounds of the Bronx. When she walked home from rehearsals, She'd hum to herself little fragments of melody that later became her own compositions. One night, she paused under a streetlight outside her apartment and whispered, "Someday, the world will hear this." And the world would. But before that day arrived, there was still the struggle, the uncertainty of a young woman trying to find her place in an industry that didn't yet know how to define her. Angela Bofill didn't just want to fit in. She wanted to change the sound of what was possible. Before the red carpets, before the flashing lights, there was only a girl from the Bronx dreaming, studying, believing, and somewhere between her mother's voice and her father's drum, the foundation of her destiny was already written. By the mid-1970s, the dream Angela Bofill carried through the streets of the Bronx was finally beginning to take shape. She was no longer the quiet student rehearsing in practice rooms. She was a voice people remembered after a single note. Her friend and mentor, flutist Dave Valentin, believed in her more than anyone. He told producers Dave Grusin and Larry Rosen, founders of the rising jazz label GRP Records, that there was something extraordinary about her tone, something that couldn't be taught. When they heard her sing for the first time, the room fell silent. "She sounds like no one else," Grusin whispered. That was enough. In 1978, Angela signed with GRP and began working on her debut album. The sessions took place in New York studios where jazz met soul, and every note carried the pulse of the city. The album would be called Angie, a name simple enough to sound familiar, but strong enough to stand alone. Angela approached those early recordings like a student and a storyteller at once. She rehearsed endlessly, sometimes redoing a single take until the emotion felt honest. Her producers marveled at how she could shift from fragile whispers to pure, resonant power within the same line. It wasn't just technical control, it was heart. When Angie was released, it quietly began to travel. Radio stations that rarely played Latin artists suddenly had her voice spinning through the night. The single, "This Time I'll Be Sweeter," became her introduction to the world, tender, soulful, and full of the kind of longing that never ages. Critics praised her for blending classical phrasing with R&B emotion, calling her the missing link between jazz, sophistication, and soul honesty. For the first time, Angela Bofill stepped onto big stages, opening for Al Jarreau and Gil Scott-Heron. She didn't just sing, she connected. Crowds who had come for someone else left, remembering her name. Between songs, she spoke softly, almost shyly, thanking the audience as if she still couldn't believe they were there for her. Her confidence grew, but so did her expectations. She wanted her second record to be bigger, deeper, and more personal. Less than a year later, she returned to the studio to create Angel of the Night. This time, she wrote much of the material herself, crafting songs that reflected who she really was, not just a voice, but a woman navigating love, ambition, and identity. When the album was finished, she listened in the empty control room as "I Try" played back through the speakers. The melody swelled, her voice floating over it like silk. It was a sound no one could mistake. She smiled quietly, knowing something inside her life had shifted. By 1979, her music was climbing charts, reaching listeners far beyond New York. The critics were right, she was bridging worlds that had never met before. She wasn't just another singer on the radio. She was proof that a Latina artist could stand in the center of R&B and make it her own. And as the final notes of Angel of the Night faded, Angela sat in that same silence she once knew as a child, but this time, it was filled with the echo of applause. Success didn't arrive like a storm. It came quietly, carried by late-night radio hosts and the steady hum of record stores that couldn't keep her albums in stock. When Angel of the Night hit the shelves in 1979, it didn't just sell, it connected. People said her voice sounded like velvet stretched over strength, as if every lyric came from a place both ancient and new. Angela's music began to travel far beyond the neighborhoods that raised her. College radio stations, jazz lounges, and R&B clubs played her songs back to back. "I Try" became the kind of song that didn't just chart, it lingered. Couples danced to it, strangers hummed it, and DJs used it to slow down the night. The song's honesty resonated with anyone who had ever loved too deeply and lost. At 25, Angela found herself performing in front of thousands, yet she never seemed changed by it. She still carried that Bronx humility, that quiet gratitude. On stage, she didn't command attention, she invited it. She would close her eyes, lean into the microphone, and let the story unfold in her voice. The crowd listened the way people listen to something sacred. Critics began calling her the first Latina soul star. For the industry, it was a label. For Angela, it was a responsibility. She once said in an interview, "I never wanted to be the first anything. I just wanted to sing." That same year, the success of Angel of the Night caught the attention of Clive Davis, the legendary head of Arista Records. Davis, known for spotting once-in-a-generation talent, believed Angela could cross from jazz and R&B into mainstream pop. To him, she had the kind of versatility that could unite audiences across genres, the voice of sophistication wrapped in emotion. In 1980, she signed with Arista and released Something About You. The collaboration promised a breakthrough, but the transition wasn't simple. The label wanted a slicker sound, more polished and radio-friendly. Angela adapted, but she never compromised her truth. Her songs, Holding Out for Love, and the title track still carried the warmth of her spirit, even if surrounded by studio gloss. Though the album didn't match her earlier success, it opened doors that had once been closed. She began working with producer Narada Michael Walden, whose bold rhythms and pop instincts challenged her to explore new sides of herself. Together, they created Too Tough, a record that balanced heart and groove, emotion and strength. When Too Tough was released in 1983, the response was electric. The title track reached number 5 on the R&B chart and number 2 on the dance chart. For Angela Bofill, it was vindication. She had proved she could survive the industry's expectations and still sound entirely like herself. Her concerts during that period were unforgettable. Fans remember her laughter between songs, her easy warmth, and the way she always took a moment to thank the musicians beside her. She carried her heritage with pride, but never as a shield, more like a melody woven through every note. By the mid-1980s, she had become a fixture on radio and television, performing on major stages once reserved for others. But fame never seemed to fit her completely. There was still something gentle, even private, about Angela. She didn't chase the spotlight, she carried it quietly. Looking back, those years were the golden climb, the chapters where everything she dreamed as a young girl in the Bronx began to bloom. The world was finally listening, and even as the applause grew louder, somewhere inside her, she still sang for the same reason she always had, because music was home. By 1983, the spotlight that Angela Bofill had once only imagined was now shining directly on her. She was no longer the young woman singing in jazz clubs or chasing airplay on local radio. She was standing at the center of R&B's most vibrant era, and the world finally knew her name. The release of Too Tough marked the beginning of her golden moment. Its title track, with its confident groove and bold rhythm, became an anthem of strength. Fans heard not just a catchy tune, but a declaration, a woman claiming her space in an industry that had often overlooked her kind of voice. When she performed it live, you could feel the room change. Her presence filled the air like light through smoke. The success was undeniable. Too Tough soared to number 5 on the R&B chart and climbed to number 2 on the dance chart, proving that her sound transcended categories. It wasn't just soul or jazz or pop, it was Angela, unfiltered and alive. The follow-up single, Tonight I Give In, reached the top 20, its softness showing the other side of her artistry, vulnerability wrapped in grace. Audiences around the country were captivated. Her concerts were sold out, from New York to Los Angeles. She performed in shimmering gowns, her curls catching the light, her voice gliding effortlessly across octaves. There was elegance, yes, but also power, and a sense of quiet defiance. Each performance felt like a statement. I belong here. Behind the scenes, Angela Bofill had become one of the few women of color headlining major stages in the early 1980s. In interviews, she often downplayed her success, saying she was just grateful to keep singing. But those who worked with her knew she carried the weight of something larger, the responsibility of being a symbol of progress in an industry that still measured artists by race, gender, and genre. Producers and musicians admired her discipline. She rehearsed endlessly, demanding excellence not only from herself but from everyone around her. She didn't need to be told twice, one of her band members once said. She heard every note, every breath, and she made you better just by being there. Her follow-up album, Teaser, kept the momentum alive with songs like I'm on Your Side. Though the record didn't reach the same commercial peak as Too Tough, it reaffirmed her artistic integrity. The song's message of unwavering support became one of her defining performances, so timeless that, years later, Jennifer Holliday would revive it as a hit of her own. At this height, Angela was performing alongside the greats, sharing stages with Diana Ross, the Crusaders, and other legends. She had become a symbol of artistry that transcended borders, inspiring both Black and Latin audiences who saw in her a reflection of themselves. Yet even at her most celebrated, she stayed grounded. Friends remember that after shows, she'd often sit quietly backstage, sipping tea, listening to the fading sound of applause as if to remind herself it was all still real. She never lost that sense of wonder or the humility that made her beloved. For a few shining years, Angela Bofill was more than a singer. She was a bridge between cultures, between genres, between what was and what could be. Her voice carried hope for those who had been told their place was somewhere in the background. And as she stood beneath the bright lights, smiling into the crowd, it felt as though the little girl from the Bronx had finally made it home. Fame can be a bright light, but it burns hotter than most people can bear. For Angela Bofill, the applause that once felt like home began to echo differently. Success had brought her everything she'd dreamed of: the recognition, the tours, the magazine covers, but behind the curtain, the pressure was relentless. The music industry of the 1980 could be unforgiving. Labels were chasing formulas, radio stations were shifting tastes, and women like Angela were often told how to sound, how to look, even how to smile. The same voice that had carried her to fame now faced a new demand: to keep producing hits faster, cleaner, safer. For an artist who sang from truth, that kind of control was a quiet form of suffocation. She had always seen herself as a musician first, not a product. But somewhere along the line, executives stopped talking about artistry and started talking about charts. Every meeting seemed to end with the same question: can you make it sound more pop? Her response was always calm, but inside, it hurt. "I sing what I feel," she once told a journalist. "If people stop feeling it, then I'd rather stop singing." The constant expectations began to take their toll. After years of touring, the exhaustion settled in. Nights blurred together, hotel rooms, flight delays, rehearsals that stretched past midnight. Her marriage to country musician Rick Benson quietly unraveled under the weight of distance and career strain. Even her friends noticed she was smiling less. Still, Angela Bofill kept moving forward. She recorded Let Me Be the One and later Intuition under Capitol Records, searching for the same spark that once came so easily. The albums carried beautiful songs, but the industry had changed. By the late 1980s, new sounds dominated the airwaves: hip-hop, synth-driven pop, and glossy R&B acts that didn't leave much room for jazz-infused soul. Her name appeared less on charts, but never disappeared from the hearts of her fans. In the Philippines, her music found new life. Listeners there embraced her deeply, relating to her blend of vulnerability and power. While America's attention drifted, overseas she was still a legend. Yet the silence that follows fame is often louder than the applause. Between shows, she began to feel that quiet closing in the loneliness that artists rarely admit out loud. She was proud of her accomplishments, but haunted by the sense that she'd been quietly moved aside. Hollywood and the music business have a way of celebrating you, then forgetting you sometimes in the same breath. Angela had broken barriers, opened doors, and proved that talent could transcend race and genre. But in an era obsessed with youth and image, it seemed no one wanted to remember the woman who'd helped shape the sound they were now selling. One night after a performance, a friend asked if she missed the fame. Angela smiled gently. "No," she said. "I just miss the singing." There was no bitterness in her voice, only honesty, the kind that comes when a person begins to understand what truly matters. The seeds of tragedy were already there, not in scandal or failure, but in the quiet erosion of a dream. She had spent a lifetime giving her voice to the world, never imagining there could come a day when the world would stop listening. And as the lights dimmed after another sold-out show, Angela stood in the stillness of the stage, unaware that the silence she felt creeping in would soon become her greatest battle. It happened quietly, almost cruelly, the way life often changes without warning. In 2006, Angela Bofill suffered a massive stroke that left her unable to speak. Just a year later, another one followed, stronger, crueler, stealing the strength from her left side and the music from her lungs. The woman whose voice once filled concert halls now struggled to whisper her own name. Friends and fans were stunned. The headlines were brief, the sympathy fleeting. In an industry that moves fast, few stopped long enough to understand the magnitude of what had been lost. For Angela, it wasn't just her livelihood that vanished. It was the very essence of who she was. She had no health insurance. The hospital bills piled up quickly, draining everything she had saved from her years on the stage. Her home filled with medical equipment and silence, a silence more painful than any absence of applause. Her manager, Rich Engel, told the Washington Post, "When you take a voice away from a singer, nothing is worse." He was right. Every day became a lesson in humility and endurance. Therapy sessions, exercises, the slow process of teaching her body how to move again. There were small victories, a finger twitch, a single step, a faint sound escaping her lips. But there were also long nights of despair, when she stared at old photos of herself performing and wondered if that person still existed. Depression followed, as it often does when identity is taken away. Friends said she rarely complained. Instead, she would smile quietly, listening to her own records like they belonged to someone else. One of them remembered her saying softly, "I used to sing like that." Her fans rallied. Benefit concerts were held across the country to help with medical costs. Fellow musicians, from jazz veterans to soul artists she once inspired, stepped forward to pay tribute. They spoke of her grace, her humility, and the way she could make a song sound like a conversation with God. Angela Bofill never wanted pity. What she wanted was purpose. And though she could no longer perform the way she once did, her spirit, that same spark that had guided her from the Bronx to the world, refused to disappear. She began journaling, reflecting, and writing down the stories behind her songs. Those who visited her said her eyes still carried light, as if a part of her music lived on in silence. The stage was gone, the spotlight had faded, but the strength that once powered her voice now held her together. And in that fragile stillness, Angela began the hardest performance of her life, one without sound, applause, or audience, a performance measured not in notes, but in survival. When the cameras stopped rolling, the silence in Angela Bofill's life became deafening. There were no more tour buses, no recording studios waiting for her arrival, only the slow rhythm of recovery. But even in that stillness, her resilience began to write a new kind of song. In 2010, 4 years after her first stroke, she did something that stunned everyone. She returned to the stage. It wasn't the triumphant comeback audiences had once dreamed of. Angela couldn't sing anymore. Her speech was slurred, her body still weak. But she refused to let her story end in silence. The show was called The Angela Bofill Experience. Instead of performing her own songs, she told her story with humor, with honesty, with gratitude. Vocalist Mesa Leak sang her classics, while Angela sat nearby, smiling, clapping, occasionally mouthing the words. At one point, she leaned toward the microphone and said softly, "I may not sing, but I'm still here." The audience wept. Some stood for minutes, applauding not for the voice they remembered, but for the woman who refused to be defeated. For many, it was one of the most powerful performances they had ever witnessed, proof that courage, too, has its own melody. As her health continued to fluctuate, she performed in select cities, San Francisco, Alexandria, and others, often to sold-out crowds. Her shows became gatherings of love, not concerts. People came to see her smile, to hear her speak, to thank her for the soundtrack of their lives. Despite the adoration, daily life was hard. The cost of care remained overwhelming. Her daughter helped manage her expenses, and friends kept organizing benefits to ease the burden. Yet, through it all, Angela never lost her warmth. Those close to her said she always greeted visitors with light in her eyes and laughter on her lips. Her legacy began to find new life through younger artists. Faith Evans sampled her 1983 ballad, "Got to Make It Up to You," in her own song, introducing Angela Bofill's sound to a new generation. The recognition was quiet but meaningful, a reminder that art, once released into the world, never truly fades. By 2023, Her perseverance was officially honored when she was inducted into the Women's Songwriters Hall of Fame. It was a late but fitting tribute, a long overdue acknowledgement of her contribution to the language of love, pain, and soul. When she passed away in June 2024 at the age of 70, the news spread softly across the world. Fans mourned, but they also celebrated. They played her songs again, not out of sadness, but remembrance. And in those final years, Angela had already found peace. She once told a friend, "I lost my voice, but I found my life." Maybe that's what her story was always meant to teach us, that even when the music stops, the echo remains. Long before tributes and awards, Angela Bofill's legacy had already taken root, not in statistics or trophies, but in the hearts of those who heard her sing. Her voice, even after it was silenced, continued to live in the music of others. Faith Evans, Jennifer Holliday, and countless new artists found pieces of themselves in her songs. When Holliday re-recorded "I'm on Your Side" in 1991, it wasn't just a cover, it was a continuation. That song had been born from Angela's spirit, a declaration of empathy that transcended language, time, and genre. Across the ocean, in the Philippines, her music never faded. Even during her years of illness, radio stations there played her records daily. Fans treated her not as a forgotten star, but as a beloved sister in sound. They held tribute concerts, sang her ballads in karaoke bars, and passed her albums down through generations. In that distant corner of the world, Angela Bofill remained eternally present. In America, her story became a quiet reminder of resilience. While Hollywood often celebrates the sensational, Angela's journey stood for something gentler, the truth that artistry doesn't always follow fame, and that some legacies grow stronger in silence. Critics revisited her discography, calling her work a bridge between Latin warmth and American soul. Younger R&B singers began to cite her as influence, admiring how she blended cultures without ever losing authenticity. Her music aged beautifully. Decades after her first album, the smooth transitions of "I Try" and "This Time I'll Be Sweeter" still sounded modern, still sincere. They carried no gimmicks, only emotion. In a world obsessed with trends, her songs reminded listeners what timeless truly means. Angela Bofill's legacy is also a cultural one. She was a pioneer, a woman of Cuban and Puerto Rican heritage who stepped into an R&B world dominated by African American and white artists and earned respect through pure talent. She didn't preach representation, she embodied it. Her success showed a generation of Latin girls that they didn't have to choose between identity and ambition. They could be both bold and soft, powerful and graceful. For artists of color who followed, her story became both inspiration and warning. Inspiration because she proved that excellence can open doors. Warning because she revealed how easily the industry forgets the ones who built those doors in the first place. Even as time passed, her peers never forgot. Musicians she once performed with spoke of her kindness, her professionalism, her laughter backstage. Angela didn't need to take the room, one bandmate said. The room gave itself to her. In her later interviews, Angela often brushed off talk of legacy. "I just hope people remember the music," she said simply. But perhaps that modesty was part of her power. She gave the world something pure songs that outlasted her body, notes that continued to breathe long after she could not. And so, every time her voice plays through a speaker in a cafe, a living room, a passing car, the past and present meet again. Angela Bofill lives there, in that sound, in that feeling that can only be described as home. When Angela Bofill was inducted into the Women's Songwriters Hall of Fame in 2023, the applause carried something deeper than celebration. It was redemption. For years, she had lived outside the industry's spotlight, quietly existing in the margins of the music world she helped shape. That evening, as her name was called, the recognition felt both late and right on time. Her daughter accepted the honor on her behalf, holding back tears as the crowd rose to its feet. Many of those standing were artists who had grown up listening to Angela's voice, the same voice that had guided them through heartbreaks, victories, and lonely nights. It wasn't just an award, it was a collective thank you, decades overdue. In America, tributes began to surface again. Journalists revisited her recordings with new appreciation. Documentaries about forgotten legends featured her story as a reminder that true artistry never fades, it just waits for the world to catch up. Even casual listeners rediscovered her through digital playlists and streaming services. The algorithm had finally done what the record industry once failed to do: put Angela Bofill back where she belonged. Her death in June 2024 at the age of 70 brought an outpouring of love from across the globe. Fans filled comment sections with memories of hearing "I Try" for the first time, or dancing to "Too Tough" at high school parties. Musicians shared stories of how her phrasing, her tone, her elegance influenced them. What struck everyone most was not the sadness, but the gratitude. Angela's story reminded people that legacy is not measured in fame or fortune, it's measured in how deeply you touch others. She didn't just sing, she spoke to people in the language of truth. Her songs had no gimmicks, no filters, only feeling. That's why they endure. The re-examination of her career also reignited conversations about representation in the music industry. Critics and cultural historians acknowledged that Angela Bofill had helped redefine what an R&B artist could look and sound like. She blurred lines long before it was fashionable, embodying an authenticity that modern artists still strive for. Her influence crossed generations. Younger singers discovered her catalog and studied her delivery, how she balanced control and vulnerability, how she allowed silence to speak as loudly as melody. To them, she wasn't a relic of the past. She was a teacher, and for those who had followed her from the beginning, her story felt personal. They had grown up with her voice, and when she lost it, they felt the loss too. In her strength, they found their own. It's easy to call Angela Bofill underrated, but that word doesn't tell the full truth. She was never forgotten by the people who mattered, the listeners who understood that her music wasn't about fame, it was about connection. In the end, the world did remember. Not with noise or spectacle, but with quiet recognition, the kind that lasts. Because some voices don't disappear, they become echoes, gentle, eternal, and unforgettable. The spotlight fades, the crowd is gone, and the stage is quiet again. In that stillness, her story lingers not as an echo of fame, but as a whisper of courage. Angela Bofill once stood where legends stood, yet what made her unforgettable was not the applause. It was the honesty in her art, the tenderness in her voice, and the grace in how she carried both triumph and tragedy. Her journey was never about perfection. It was about persistence, a life shaped by rhythm, challenged by silence, and redeemed by love. Even when her voice was taken from her, she found another way to speak. Through her laughter, through her resilience, through every person her music touched. In the end, she became something greater than a star. She became a reminder that art is not measured in how loudly it's heard, but in how deeply it's felt. Angela Bofill's legacy belongs to all who ever chased a dream against the odds, to every artist who gave everything and asked for nothing in return. Her story tells us that the truest kind of fame is the one that lives quietly in people's hearts, long after the curtain falls. And maybe that's the beauty of her life, that she never had to shout to be remembered. Her music still breathes in the quiet corners of living rooms, in car radios late at night, in the memories of those who grew up with her songs. So tonight, as the lights go down, maybe take a moment to listen again, not just to her voice, but to her courage, because remembering her is how we keep that courage alive. Do you think Hollywood ever gave Angela Bofill the respect she truly deserved? If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and help us keep her memory alive. Let's make sure the legends who built the soundtrack of our lives are never forgotten. Because some voices never fade, they just shine where fewer ears can hear.